New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Kim Jones, part of the marketing team at Balchem, and today we welcome Dr. Frank Mitloehner from UC Davis and the Clear Center to dive into new options for how different regions and production systems can meet global food demands sustainably. Dr. Mitloehner is a professor and air quality specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. Frank is also director of the Clear Center, which has two cores, research and communication. The Clear Center brings clarity to the intersection of animal agriculture and the environment, helping our global community understand the environmental and human health impacts of livestock, so we can make informed decisions about the foods we eat while reducing the environmental impacts. As part of his position with UC Davis and Cooperative Extension, Dr. Mitloehner collaborates with the animal agriculture sector to create better efficiencies and mitigate pollutants. He's passionate about understanding and mitigating air emissions from livestock operations, as well as studying the implications of these emissions on the health of farm workers and neighboring communities. In addition, he's focusing on food production challenges that will become a global issue as the world's population grows to nearly 10 billion by 2050. Dr. Mitloehner received his master's in engineering from the University of Leipzig, Germany, and his PhD in animal science from Tech University. Frank recruited to UC Davis in 2002 to fill its divide between livestock and quality. Dr. Mitloehner, welcome back to the Real Science Lecture Series. The floor is now yours.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to talk to you today about sustainability in animal agriculture, and the question as to why we need a toolkit of solutions, to improve sustainability in animal agriculture. I am, as was already said in the introduction, the director of the Clear Center. I would say this is an entity that is worthwhile looking up for you. I will show the web address later. Research and communications are both equally important for us and to us, and I think should be important to all of us, because if there's one thing that's not going well in animal agriculture, it's the way that we communicate about it. Just as an icebreaker, a couple slides here. This is one of the reasons why I was hired some 22 years ago to be professor and air quality specialist here in California. You see the state, you see an area here called the Great Central Valley. That's where 50% of all fruits and vegetables are grown in the United States, 90% of all nuts, 20% of all dairy. And because of this region being surrounded by mountain ranges, bad air can accumulate, and you see this milky stuff here, that's smog. Okay, and that's the reason why I'm here, to help mitigate air pollutants from animal agriculture, okay, which are of course not the chief reason for bad air, but they also contribute to some extent. Just to give you some orientation, this year where my mouse is, that's San Francisco, this year's Sacramento, and I'm here in Davis. Now, I'll skip a couple slides here. This is one of my favorite slides. It shows a fence line. On the left side of the fence, you see a California dairy with 1,000 happy California cows. On the right side of the fence, you see a recent urban encroachment with 1,000 unhappy California residents. And I oftentimes ask my audience, why do you think these people moved there? Why would they have moved that close to a commercial dairy? And the reason to that question is that the land was relatively cheap. That's why they moved there. And now the question is, what do you think was the first thing after they moved there? And I can already hear you say complain, but no, they didn't complain. Complaining is for losers. They sued the dairy. And just imagine you all of a sudden have 1,000 new neighbors that don't like you, and they take you to court. Who do you think has the greater power in court, the greater political power, the greater, just power in a courtroom? It's clearly the right side of the fence and not the left side. That's a reality that I'm confronted with here in California, one that's bothering me, has been bothering me for the longest time, but it's not going away. And it's happening in other states and throughout the world as well. I saw a scenario just like that a month ago in Colombia, of all places. I never thought that this craziness happens in other parts of the world, but it does. And if somebody were to petition to have a urban encroachment right next to a farm, you better advise the farming community to step up and speak out. I will now talk about an issue that's near and dear to me, and that is, in my opinion, the Achilles heel in animal agriculture, and that is the impact that animal agriculture has on climate. A very hot topic discussed in the media up and down all around. Activists use this as the number one tool against animal agriculture. So what is this all about? What you see on this slide is the sun radiating down solar beams to the earth, and normally that solar radiation and, of course, the heat contained therein would be reflected back into space. If there weren't this blanket of greenhouse gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, form a blanket retaining some of that solar radiation and with it the heat back to Earth. And that makes life on Earth possible. Without these greenhouse gases, the heat from the sun would just escape and it would be way too cold on Earth. So we need greenhouse gases. They are important. Gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide are important, but the problem is humans are producing too much of these greenhouse gases. And that means this blanket is getting too thick. And that means too much heat is retained. And that means we have an increasing amount of heating going on, a phenomenon called global warming or climate change. So while most climate scientists would tell you the main culprit of human activity on climate is the burning of fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and gas, releasing CO2, our special friends, as I call them, and now I'm being facetious, those who don't like us very much say, no, we should focus on methane. And here's why they say we should focus on methane. This slide here shows global greenhouse gas emissions by sectors. So you see here in red, these are industry, transport, buildings, and so on and so on. Energy stands for the burning of fossil fuels through all of these sectors. And you can see in green here, agriculture and forestry. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not animal agriculture. This is all agriculture and forestry globally. You see in dark green up there, you see livestock and manure. The United Nations FAO estimates that of all global greenhouse gases, livestock emits 11%. 11%. That number has come down. 15 years ago, the same organization said it was 18%. Then they went down to 14.5%. Now they say it's 11%, a number that I agree with on the global side of things. In fact, I have named that number some 15 years ago when it was not very popular to say that. But today, the United Nations FAO agrees. This is a number that holds true for global greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. To contrast that, all of agriculture is responsible for roughly 10%. Animal agriculture, and that's the number you should remember, is responsible for 4% of all greenhouse gases, according to the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. So take-home message, 4% of all US greenhouse gases stems from animal agriculture, according to the EPA. The reason why our special friends say we should focus on methane and not on, let's say, CO2 is the so-called global warming potential, which says that one molecule of methane traps the heat from the sun 20 times as good as one molecule of CO2. And then there's nitrous oxide, even more powerful in trapping heat from the sun, 265 times. In class, I explained that by saying, just imagine we were to drink 3 beverages. One is a glass full of beer, one a glass full of wine, one a glass full of vodka, and then 3 of us drink these 3 respective glasses. I bet I know who gets drunk first. Meaning these beverages are different in their potency, and so are these greenhouse gases. Methane, almost 30 times more potent per molecule. But it's not true that this is where the narrative around methane stops, where it ends, because methane is significantly different from other greenhouse gases, such as CO2 or nitrous oxide, insofar that methane is short-lived. CO2, once it's produced and released in the atmosphere, stays there for 1,000 years. Methane, for roughly 1 decade. Methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. And this next slide shows it nicely. This slide shows the global methane budget. On the left side, you see numerous sources, such as fossil fuel production, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, and so on. All of these sources amount to the first half bubble, 558, let's call it 560 teragrams of that gas being produced by these various sources. 560. And this is where the reporting in the media ends, when it should just start. But that's where it ends, leaving out the fact that methane is not just produced by sources, but on the right side you see there are sinks of methane, and they amount to close to 550 teragrams. And that means 560 are produced, 550 are destroyed, and that leaves the balance, which is 10. In this red box you see it. So we are dealing with 10 and not with 560 teragrams of methane globally. And that is still a number we seek to further reduce, but one that's definitely different, I think everybody would agree, to just looking at the source number. So what is it that destroys methane? On the right side, you see a large arrow pointing down, and underneath it says, sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. And what that means is that there are molecules in the air called radicals, and these radicals destroy the methane. To be precise, they're called hydroxyl radicals. And these hydroxyl radicals destroy this gas, methane, in 10 to 12 years. That's very important to know, because it leads to the fact that methane has a very short lifespan. I told you carbon dioxide 1,000 years, nitrous oxide also a long time, 110 years, but methane has a lifespan of 12 years. And that means that if you have a constant source of methane, let's say a constant source of methane in the form of a farm with 100 cows, your parents started that farm some 50 years ago with 100 cows, still has 100 cows today, and you're not intending to grow, then the methane that's produced by these cows through belching or through their manure, and the methane that's naturally destroyed are roughly in balance. And that means a constant source, and this is really important, a constant source of methane does not add additional warming to the atmosphere, because the same amount that's produced is also being destroyed. If you were to grow that herd, that dairy herd, from 100 cows to 150 cows, then you're increasing methane because you now have 50 additional cows. And that would cause new additional warming. If you, however, with your 100 cow dairy, learn how to mitigate methane through feed additives, through manure management or other means, then that methane would go down over time, and that would mean that you are now destroying more methane or preventing it than what's being replenished. And then warming can go down. And I want to show you an analogy of 2 bathtubs. The first is a bathtub analogy of how CO2 warms the planet. And I'm using a bathtub analogy with a bathtub having a faucet but no drain, meaning there's only a source of water but no sink. There's no drain, okay? And whether you turn the water on low, medium, or high, the water levels rise. And this is what it looks like. CO2, the faucet is on high, the water levels rise. But if the faucet were on low or on super high, the levels would still rise. They can only rise because there's no drain. They cannot go down. With methane, we just learned it's not just produced by sources, but it's also destroyed by sinks. And for the analogy, that would mean that we have a bathtub that has a faucet and it has a drain. So this is methane now. If we have our faucet on normal, water goes into the bathtub and an equal amount of water leaves the bathtub, meaning in the case of methane, if you have a constant amount going in and a constant amount going out, the water level stays stable. If you reduce the inflow, if you turn the faucet on low, then more water leaves the bathtub through the open drain than is replenished. And that means water levels can sink, can go down. And that's precisely what happens. If you increase both CO2 and methane, not surprisingly here, you see the warming at the bottom, then the warming goes up. More so for CO2 than for methane, because CO2 accumulates, methane does not. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty on this, but if both gases, CO2 and methane, that's CH4, if they stay stable, then what I just explained with the 100-head dairy happens, that even though the methane is stable, the related warming stays stable as well, because an equal amount of what's produced is being destroyed. Every time we burn fossil fuel, we add additional warming. That's that CO2 going up. But now let's look at what happens when we reduce both CO2 and methane. Let's say CO2 from a power plant and methane from a cattle herd are being reduced. What happens? So let's say the red line on the right top here shows the CO2 from a power plant. Let's say the power plant gets cleaner and cleaner. Over time, it produces less power. Eventually, to achieve net zero, they turn it off. They turn that power plant off and replace it with something else, solar or wind or who knows what. Then that reducing CO2 over time leads to the warming effect at the bottom in red. Namely, that even though we are reducing CO2, the warming from that reducing CO2 still goes up all the way to the point when we turn off the power plant. And then the warming plateaus. And that's what it takes to have a plateauing effect for a reduction of the burning of fossil fuels, resulting in reducing CO2. You have to turn the thing off for the warming to stop increasing. But look what happens, and that's in blue, what happens when you reduce methane over time. At the bottom you can see if you reduce methane, you instantaneously reduce the warming. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a real opportunity for us in animal agriculture, because methane, CH4, is our main greenhouse gas. If we learn to reduce this gas, then we have the effect that you see at the bottom right, namely that the warming goes down. Not just will we be less of a problem, but we will be part of a solution by reducing methane. So I don't want anybody on this call, anyone on this webinar, think that Mitloehner diminishes or downplays the importance of methane. Methane is an important greenhouse gas. In my opinion, it's more of an opportunity than a problem. Okay, to me, the major problem among greenhouse gases is CO2, because even though you see it on the right, even though we are reducing CO2 over time, we still see an increase in warming. But when we learn how to reduce methane, then something that can be a problem becomes a solution. And we in animal agriculture have methane as our main greenhouse gas. And that sets us apart from all other sectors that produce greenhouse gases, that it is methane that is our main deal. So the question really is, can we do what we see on the right side, reduce methane and gain that effect that you see at the bottom right? Is that something we can do? And we'll get to that in a few minutes. Just in case that you wonder, well, what regions in the world produce methane, and how important is enteric fermentation, meaning the belching of methane, as well as animal manure. Here you see different countries in the world and their relative importance to methane production. That's not all greenhouse gases. That's not CO2. That's only methane now that we are talking about, okay? So you can see some of the regions in the world are sticking out. Others produce less. Now here in blue, you see the relative importance of methane from animal agriculture. See, for example, in South Asia, the blue is the lion's share of their column. You see in North America, it is also an important one. Okay, it's not the all-encompassing. It's not what many of the activists, our special friends, try to make the public believe, that it's the driving issue, which without addressing would cause to climate disaster. That's not what it is, but it is a sizable chunk and one that we can address and one that we should address. With respect to species contributing to methane, by far the most important ones are our ruminant friends, and here in particular, cattle. And that's true globally. Pigs and chicken produce very little methane. The vast majority of the methane they produce comes from their animal manure. So, but everything you see in blue here is enteric fermentation, meaning the methane that's belched out, except for the monogastric animals. For pigs, it's actually flatulence. Now, there are people who say what we really need to concentrate on is what we eat and reduce consumption of animal source foods. This is from a recent United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, report showing consumption patterns of animal source foods in different regions of the world. You see that in Europe, animal source foods are plateauing with respect to consumptions, but in most other parts of the world, they are not. They are increasing. And this is really important to note because there's a pipe dream in parts of our media that all we need to do is just change what we eat and that will affect the climate impact of our food choices. This slide here is also an important one. It shows the human population increase in different parts of the world. You see in Asia, human population will increase by 40%, in Africa by close to 50%. The Americas will be relatively stable and Europe will slightly shrink. The reason for the population increase is not so much that there are now huge numbers of babies in parts of the world being born, but the reason for the population increase by and large is due to increasing life expectancy of people. In places like Africa, where life expectancy used to be 50 or 60 in the past, it's now 70 or 80. And that means more mouths to feed. And by the way, elderly populations have different dietary needs. And I don't need to tell you that the difference in dietary needs are largely around proteins. And so animal source foods will play an even more important role in the future than they have been in the past. So just to give you another little idea as to how significant this issue is, we call it, by the way, the 2050 challenge, because by 2050 we have to deal with that much more people. I'm in my 50s. When I was a little boy, we had 3 billion people in the world. Today we have 8 billion, and by the time I'm an old man, we will have 9.5 billion people in the world, and that is a conservative projection. In other words, throughout my life, human population on this planet will have tripled from 3 to over 9 billion people in one lifetime. And that just simply means we have to do a much better job producing food in the future than what we did in the past. And what will lead us there is a toolbox approach. We have to become more efficient, yes, particularly in developing countries, more efficient in producing food. We have to use all natural resources, particularly those that are not suitable for crop production. We call those marginal lands. It's very important because if we don't use these resources, we will fail in addressing this 2050 challenge of feeding that much more people in the future than we have in the past. This here is one of my other favorite slides. It shows the world from space and a circle over Southeast Asia that contains more people in it than the rest of the world combined. More people live inside this circle than outside this circle. Pretty mind-blowing. And this is one of the challenges of this 2050 overall challenge, which is we have a very limited amount of cropland in the world. What you see in color here is what's called arable land. That's 1/3 of all agricultural land. I repeat that. The cropland is also called arable land, and it makes up 1/3 of all agricultural land. The remaining 2/3 of all agricultural land is called marginal land. 2/3 of all agricultural lands are marginal lands and can only be used with ruminant livestock. Why? Because the only thing that grows on that marginal land, which doesn't have enough moisture or is not fertile enough, or maybe too hilly, too rocky, or has other reasons why we can't grow crops there, the only thing that grows on that marginal land is grass. And grass contains cellulose, the most abundant biomass in the world. The only animals that can digest cellulose are ruminant livestock. So it is true when our special friends say that the majority of agricultural land is used for livestock. It is true. But what they conveniently leave out is that if it weren't for ruminant livestock, that land could not be used for human food production. So let's be honest about the discussion around animal source foods and how it impacts the environment. And take the politics out of it. Okay, we need marginal lands to feed a growing human population. We need technologies, techniques. We need a toolbox of solutions to address the 2050 challenge and to help our farmers get us there. So what are those pathways that we can use to reduce emissions, to increase productivity, and so forth? First of all, the one pathway that will not work is the one that the activists, our special friends, toot out there we should engage in. Namely, they say we should change what we eat. And we should move from an animal-based or an omnivore diet to a plant-based diet. This here's a depiction from the United Kingdom. And you can see here omnivores on top. They call it meat eaters, but these are not carnivores or so. These are people who are omnivores. Then the second line there is the flexitarians. They eat animal source foods, but not every day. Then you see vegetarians, pescatarians, and you say vegans. And you can see that there is no sizable fluctuation over time in these eating patterns that people have, these dietary choices in the United Kingdom. The same can be observed in the United States and throughout the rest of the world. In developing countries, what is going up, and up are animal source foods. People, particularly in developing countries where starving, where stunting, where malnutrition occurs, what people do when they have more disposable income is to feed their families an egg a day or a glass of milk a day or some meat a day to circumvent those malnutrition forms that they have been suffering on for so long. So we are not very successful, as our special friends would say, in changing what people will eat. In fact, in 98%, 98, in 98% of all US refrigerators today, you'll find animal source foods such as eggs, dairy, meat. However, the media is absolutely full with articles saying that we need to eat less meat, particularly in the developing world, in the developed world, so in the US, in Europe, in order to reduce the footprint, the environmental footprint of food. In fact, these media outlets, right before the last COP28, the last International Climate Conference, said that the United Nations FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, will come out with a report. Some of you might still remember Livestock's Long Shadow from the same agency. That was the report that I criticized so intensely some 15 years ago or so, that the FAO would come out with a very authoritative report, they said, which would suggest that we all need to stop eating animal source foods and move to a plant-based diet. It was not just Bloomberg, it was everywhere, that reporting that the upcoming COP28, and that was last November, would say that, would recommend that. I was at that COP28 conference in Dubai, and I gave 2 talks there. And one of the presenters after me was the FAO, releasing their report. Their report is called the Pathways Report. And the Pathways Report was very interesting. And by the way, after I was very critical of the FAO for a very long time, I had then decided to work closely with them. In fact, became chairman of one of their partnership committees. And I had never heard the kind of things that came out of the media as being reported by the FAO, namely that we need to change what we eat and so on. So I gave my talks, then the FAO gave theirs, and they released their report. Their report is called Pathways Towards Lower Emissions. And if you take a shot of this QR code, it will get you there. And I recommend this report very much. I think it is a sound report helping farmers to get to a point where emissions can be minimized. So what is the take-home message of that report? I will lead you to it because it's kind of a convoluted slide, but it's a very important one. What you see on this slide are different tools on the x-axis to reduce greenhouse gases on the y-axis. The first column shows base year emissions, meaning emissions from the global livestock sector pretty much today. The second column shows the emissions that humanity will add until the year 2050. The third column shows the total emissions as they will occur by 2050 from the livestock sector, affecting our climate, if we do business as usual, if we don't mitigate, if we just act as if we don't care about climate change. Okay, so this is what the FAO projects will be emitted by livestock by 2050. What they want the livestock sector to look like by 2050 is the last column. You see a much lower number, 1,900, coming down from what is projected over 9,000. And what the FAO says we need to do to get us from the 9,000, which is projected, to the 1,900 are different tools. And you can see here the main tools being productivity increases. That's the biggest one. The second biggest one is breeding. The third biggest one is improved animal health. All tools that I know Belgium is very strong in providing. And then you see many other tools. The second least effective way of impacting our climate from the animal agricultural sector is the fourth column. And what is the fourth column? Dietary changes. Dietary changes refers to us humans going plant-based with our diets. So what I just told you 5 minutes ago, that the media reported, and I mean not just Bloomberg, but everybody reported it, namely that the FAO says we all need to change what we eat, was simply not true. The FAO did not say that, but they said that dietary changes toward a plant-based diet is pretty much an ineffective way of reducing the carbon footprint of animal source foods. That's very important because it tells you something about the way we receive our information these days. So in other words, it requires a toolbox of tools to get us to where we need to go. Just like you need more than just a hammer or just a screwdriver to build a house, you need a toolbox of tools to build a house. We need a toolbox of solutions to help our farmers to minimize emissions. I want to give you an example, namely one here from California, where, and again, I focus on methane, not all greenhouse gases, just methane. You see a pie graph here, and the amount of methane that comes from the dairy sector alone. You also see here in orange other livestock. You see the dairy and livestock sector make up a good chunk of the methane in the state of California. As a result, these are sectors where there's a lot of focus when an agency like the California Air Resources Board wants to reduce methane by a lot. Because in California, we have the strictest climate laws in the world, particularly on methane, where the state says we want to reduce methane by 40%, 40, by the year 2030. And for the dairy sector, that means they need to reduce 7.2 million metric tons. Now, that number might not mean much to you, but just remember the number 7, okay, for the dairy sector. So they need to reduce approximately 7 million metric tons. The rest of livestock 1.8, but dairy 7.27. Is that possible? Well, two of my colleagues and I wrote a report called Meeting the Call. And in that report, we found that there will be four major thrusts to reduce the carbon footprint of the dairy industry, and that these reductions will amount to a range of emission reductions anywhere between 7.6 to 10.6 million metric tons. So I want to repeat, the state says the dairy sector must reduce 7.2. We predict that it will reduce 7.6 to 10.6. There's a range, and that range is explained by uncertainties around how well certain technologies will be implemented. But that's the range we are predicting. And here is how that range comes about. We have productivity increases in the California dairy industry. We are producing more milk with relatively fewer cows, and fewer cows year after year means that's called attrition, a reduction of greenhouse gases. So we have approximately 1% shrinkage of the dairy herd year after year. Then we have alternative manure management practices, and they lead to a range of emission reductions. Then we have dairy digesters, reducing about 4 million metric tons. That's a main contributor to the reductions. And then we have feed additives. One of them, Bovaer, just came online. Is now FDA approved. The question of how many farmers will use a feed additive determines whether we reduce greenhouse gases, or methane in particular, by 250,000 or by as much as 2 million metric tons. So if you now add these different ranges together, you arrive at what I'm depicting in the title here, a range of 7.6 to 10.6. Now you might say, well, Mitloehner says that, but Mitloehner might be too industry friendly or too close to industry. Can he be trusted? Any of that. Well, I have news for those of you who feel that way. I went to a workshop that was organized by the California Air Resources Board, which is our state's leading agency, on this very topic of reduction of greenhouse gases from the dairy sector. And they are predicting the reduction of greenhouse gases from the California dairy sector to be 6.6 million metric tons by 2030. But they did not include feed additives. So if feed additives are coming online and are being used, then we will achieve the goal of a 40% reduction pretty easily. Now you might ask, well, how is that even possible? What are the ways that they do it, and how do you do it without breaking the bank? California decided to go a voluntary, incentive-based approach pathway. And that means rather than using rules and regulations and shoving it down people's throats, California's legislature decided to financially incentivize the reductions of emissions. So for example, if you have a dairy digester, then you produce biogas, you sell the biogas, you make it into fuel, and you get carbon credits for that. In the future, if you use feed additives, you reduce enteric methane, there will be a financial incentive for that. The one technology of anaerobic digesters, you see one here at the bottom right, that's a covered lagoon where the biogas is trapped underneath. That's what the bulging out of the plastic means. And then this biogas is converted into vehicle fuel. You see here renewable natural gas from dairy digesters is converted into pure methane and put into semi-trucks and buses as fuel. So that's one means of reducing methane. So far, it has led to a 30% reduction of methane in the state of California. And there will be more. In 5 years, I predict that half of all dairy manure produced in California will end up in a covered lagoon producing fuels and or power. There are other means of reducing enteric methane. One of those means is feed additives. A couple of them are listed here. We have just learned that methane is a heritable trait. There are now genomic tests. You can test whether a cow is a high or low methane producing cow. And then you can use the low methane producing cows for breeding. All the work that we have done to predict the future of California dairy is summarized in this report called Meeting the Call. It's available when you go onto this QR code. We are really bullish about The statement that our dairy industry will meet the call of a 40% reduction of methane without breaking the bank. They will even make money doing it if they do it smart. And that 40% reduction will, as I showed you earlier, will have a profound impact on our climate, because these strong reductions of methane will lead to a strong reduction of warming. And that's a big deal. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not what our special friends call greenwashing. This is real hard physics and chemistry, and working with farmers to do the right thing. Other means of reducing methane are depicted in this paper here, or explained in this paper. I will just put it out here. You can take a screenshot. It does a good job explaining what's out there in order to reduce enteric methane. I'm particularly bullish of the breeding approach. I think this is really interesting, because if you were to select your herd to only have low methane producing cows, that would be a one-time fix, a permanent fix. But feed additives have their place, manure management has their place, and so forth. And of course, increased animal productivity. One thing in summary that will not work to reduce the environmental footprint of livestock is for people to change what they eat. It is a pipe dream of some of the activists out there. It is also a pipe dream of the majority of our media that's tooting that. It's not going to work. People eat animal source foods for various reasons. It might be the taste. It might be their culture. It might be their preference. It might be the nutrients that are contained therein. Whatever the reason, it's a very personal decision what you eat, just like it is a personal decision who you pray to, if you pray to anyone, or who you vote for, or who you marry. These are personal decisions in life, and I strongly resent any kind of attempt to make people, with or against their will, eat something that some people think should be eaten and not what they think shouldn't be. Consumption is not predicted to switch in any major way, at least not into a downward direction in any place, except for maybe a place like Germany. But in most places in the world, it's not. If you really want to reduce emissions from the food system, then you need to work with farmers and not against farmers. That might sound like a very trivial statement, but it is true. Once you explain to farmers how they contribute to an issue, once you explain to them what they can do to reduce it, you can see miracles occurring. And I'm very bullish and upbeat about what I'm seeing here in California. You might think about California what you want. I know many of you might be critical, and for good reason. But in that respect, I tell you, I see the job being done, and the job being done well. What I can also tell you is that scientists who accompany this whole development of implementation of mitigation on farms need to have public funding. Not just industry funding, but public funding. Because if there is one angle that our special friends try to discredit people like myself, it is by saying, look where they get their money from. They can't be trusted because they get money from industry. We need to have public funding in addition to industry funding to show that the public has an interest in making our agricultural sector more sustainable. I have two more slides here. This is one showing how little, how tiny the public funding is in and around, particularly animal agriculture. It is dismal, the amount of funding that's provided by various sources. But the research needs are massive. And the funding levels are going down. You see here from the early 2000s, where they were pretty high, they've gone down by a third. And that means fewer and fewer people will do research into how to reduce emissions from animal agriculture, and that's not sustainable. So with that, the website clear.ucdavis.edu is a website from our Clear Center. It contains explainers, blogs, news stories, YouTube videos, and so on various topics around sustainability. And that's, I think, a really good resource for you to being used. It's for free, of course, and it addresses many of those topics that we all confronted with day in, day out. So either go into the webpage or contact us directly. Okay, clear.ucdavis.edu is our webpage. And with that, I close, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mitloehner. And before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
Delivering the perfect ration for the rumen microbes might be more important and more challenging than feeding the cow. NitroSure precision-release nitrogen delivers a consistent supply of rumen-protected nitrogen to improve animal performance, maximize profitability, and minimize nitrogen excretion into the environment. With NitroSure, you get improved fiber digestion, increased microbial protein production, and reduced dependence on expensive protein sources with a high carbon footprint. Feed the microbes that feed your cows with NitroSure precision-release nitrogen from Balchem. Visit balchem.com to learn more.
As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. So we do have quite a few questions coming in. So Frank, your first question is from John, and this came in early in your presentation. Are the warming effects of the gases additive? That was when you had the world map up there and you showed all the different gases and the percents of their warming effect.
Yes, they're additive.
Okay. That was quick.
Short answer, but yes, they're additive.
Okay. The next one comes in from Kelly. So much is shared about green energy sources like wind and solar, but how should that impact really be discussed? What are the talking points we in ag should share?
So let me first start with fossil fuels again. So fossil fuels are things such as oil, coal, and gas. Fossil fuels originally were plant and animal material, which many moons ago died, decayed, fossilized, accumulated underground. And over the last 70 years, humans took about half of that fossil fuel out of the ground and we burned it, that oil, coal, and gas. And every time we burn it, we produce CO2, and that CO2 accumulates. Every time we burn oil, coal, and gas, we add additional warming. We do not do that when we produce power from wind or from solar. And so we are not adding additional carbon to the atmosphere when using these renewable resources. So we will, over time, use less and less fossil resources, and we will use more and more renewable resources, such as wind, such as solar. They have a lot of advantages. They also have some disadvantages, namely that if we don't have a windy day, if we have no wind, or if we have winter conditions of little sun, then we might have issues. In my opinion, we should definitely also consider nuclear in the mix and look into new type of reactors to help us produce the energy that we need at any given time, not just on sunny and or windy days.
Now, just as a follow-up question to that, a lot of times in agriculture, we talk about that there is so much that's not included in the review of solar and wind power, like the impact of getting rid of those pieces. Should that play into the conversation?
It should play into the conversation, but not in a way that we say, well, we don't want renewables. We need renewables in the mix. And we also not just stop using fossil fuels. We will continue using them, but we can't just say, well, screw it, we just use it however much we want. I think we need to have a good mix, just like the toolbox approach that I just presented. We need to have a toolbox approach for our power production as well. But I can tell you, I sat next to a guy on a plane who was a civil engineer. And when I asked him what he does for a living, he told me, "Oh, I'm responsible for the decommission of wind towers." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. I always wondered where those giants go when they're done. What happens to them?" And he told me, "We cannot recycle them because there are different types of plastics and metals all melted together. You cannot recycle them." And I said, "So what do you do with them?" He said, "We dig huge holes and we put them in there." And he showed me a photo. I tell you, I've never seen a hole like that ever, with 100 windmills lying in it, old 40,
Hmm.
50-year-old windmills. So that is not a way that we should produce those things. We need to think about how to produce those things so that they can be separated into their components and be reused later. The way we're currently doing it is not sustainable.
And maybe that needs to be a whole nother webinar, because so much of agricultural land is being leased out to those kinds of situations. So we'll leave that one for now because we've got a lot of other questions to get to. The next question is, what output reduction should the industry focus on? Total output, per animal, or per unit of milk produced?
Yes.
All of the above.
All of the above. All of the above. So what farmers oftentimes focus on is what's called the carbon intensity, meaning per unit of milk or per pound of feed eaten and so on. And that makes a big difference to your bottom line. It's very important. But environmental agencies care for total emissions. They want to see that the total emissions of a sector go down. For example, the total emissions of the California dairy sector need to be reduced by 7.2 million metric tons. They want to see that number being reached, and they don't care how it's being reached. Our farmers do, and I support our farmers, but I also keep in mind what the overall goal is. People like myself help the farming industry to achieve the overall goal as well. By the way, and I want to say that very clearly, when your little advertisement reel came on the nitrogen compound that you that is the speed editor, while my presentation focused on greenhouse gases, particularly on methane, which is a carbon molecule, um, the next big thing will be nitrogen. And I know that because I'm looking into Europe and I see that the discussion in all over Europe is on reactive nitrogen. And this is all the nitrogen compounds that can result when nitrogen in the form of urea is converted into ammonia, into nitrate, into nitrous oxide, to various forms of nitrogen. It will become very important for us to manage nitrogen better. So um, don't think it's all about methane and Mitloehner only thinks about methane. I think about the other things as well. And nitrogen is up and coming.
Excellent. Yep. The next question comes from Danielle. How do you square the statement that CO2 remains for 1,000 years while over 250 trillion tons are fixed annually in the carbon cycle?
Yeah, so that's true. There are enormous amounts of carbon locked away in oceans, and oceans are the number one sink, as well as in plants. This is, however, a process that is the natural background. Okay, just like we have volcanoes, and we always had volcanoes and swarms and natural sources and sinks, they are the normal background. Okay, what leads to the fluctuations that we see is most likely human activity in the different greenhouse gases, CO2, in methane, in nitrous oxide. Um, there's no conclusive proof of that, but there's very strong evidence. I'm not a climatologist, but from what I see, I agree with it looking as if these human activities that drive CO2, that drive methane and other gases up, coalesce with changes in temperature.
Next question. Should we expect more impact to reduce global warming by intensification production systems from grazing to feed bunk, or by reducing herd sizes?
So we can reduce the carbon footprint in each and every one of our production systems. Okay, I do not promote a conversion of, let's say, grazing systems uh, to CAFO style or so. We do need all of them. We do need grazing systems for all the marginal land I pointed at. That's very important. But a grazing system can also be more sustainable by being more productive. We can, for example, improve forage quality, or we can improve breeding so that the animals that do the grazing are more productive, or we can use um, certain mineral mixes or so for animals that are under grazing conditions to get some compounds into their body that boost productivity, and so forth. um, we can increase productivity in each and every one of our production systems, and we must. And we need to make sure that the animal health is optimized. And that is particularly true in developing countries. I want to make this statement because it's so important. While our special friends and while many agencies focus on what we do in developed countries like the United States to reduce carbon footprint, nitrogen footprint, and so on, while that's happening, a whopping 80%, 80, of all environmental footprints of animal agriculture globally, 80% of that occurs in developing countries. 80%. And the reason why it happens there is because the herd sizes are humongous and the productivity per animal is dismal. And that is why the focus should be squared on developing countries and improving their productivities. And that doesn't mean making their farms look like ours, but it does mean help them to have healthy animals, more productive animals, and so on.
Great answer. The next question comes from Laria. Do you worry about criticism that with the sustainability model, dairies will be making more money from selling low carbon fuel standard credits than from selling milk?
Um, It might happen. I've seen some situations where a farmer gets more money through low carbon fuel standard credits and other credits related to emission reductions than through the sale of their milk. Um, but why would I be critical of that? I mean, if a dairy has an additional income stream for doing something that doesn't break the bank, then I'm all for it. I think it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing to diversify the income stream of a dairy. Um, that's where I stand.
Agree. Agree. They're always looking for other ways to add to their bottom line. So next question came from Daniel. Says thank you for your presentation. He has several questions. Let's look at one. What's your viewpoint about net zero in 2050? How is the progress going in the U.S.?
Um, on the dairy side, nationwide, it's not going where we want it to go. And the reason is that we see more conversions of dairy manure being stored in liquid systems, in lagoons. And lagoons increase the amount of emissions versus solid storage. So nationwide, we have seen an increase and not a decrease of greenhouse gases. So nationwide, currently, we are not seeing that we are making the progress we want to see. I told you in California, we are seeing that. And I told you why we are seeing it. The question now is, how can we turn the tides nationwide? It is very important that the dairy industry and the other industries, before making any claims, sit down and really be sure that whatever they promise can be kept, because there's nothing worse than broken promises and broken trust. And so I think it is absolutely doable to achieve sizable reductions all the way to net zero. I call it climate neutrality, the point by which an industry does not add additional warming or go beyond, reduce warming. It is possible if we take the methane bull by the horns. If we take the methane bull by the horns, we must reduce methane if we want to achieve sizable reductions all the way down to net zero.
One last question, we'll have you kind of talk through what research do you have upcoming at the Clear Center that may be helping with this?
So we're doing a lot of different research trials, some of them on feed additives. We are about to do a long-term study on Bovaer, 1.5 years of feeding it under our university dairy conditions, very controlled, but also on a commercial dairy with 2,000 cows. We are doing research also on early life programming, where you feed something to a calf for the first 2 months of its life, then you stop, but you see the impacts of that change in gut health, in gut microbes, prolonging through the rest of its life. It's called early life programming. I'm very interested in the breeding aspect, okay, on genomic testing of cows for low methane, and then reducing herd size emissions by 30%, 30. That is a very exciting angle. Then we do research on animal manure. Those microbes that produce the methane hate oxygen. They must have anaerobic conditions, and they do have that in a lagoon. They do have it in a rumen, these anaerobic conditions. If we go ahead and we oxygenate to some extent lagoons, meaning we get oxygen into the lagoon, then that would make the life of the methanogens, those methane-forming microbes, miserable. And we are now doing research on what's called nanobubblers. Okay, these are a device that you put right next to the inlet of the lagoon, infusing very, very, very fine oxygen bubbles into the waste stream, not with the goal of oxygenating the whole lagoon, but the inlet, and therefore making the life of those methane-forming microbes miserable. So we are doing research on different, very different parts of the value chain, and not just for dairy, also for beef, for pigs, for poultry. We work on all commodities, and not just on the research side, but equally important on the comm side, on the communication side, where we have hired journalists, filmmakers, social media experts working with me to not just do the research, but also getting it out in ways people can understand.
Do you want to put in a plug quickly for your international summit, methane summit?
Yeah, we have a State of the Science Summit every May here at UC Davis. We have phenomenal attendance of exactly the right people. If you're interested in additives or in reduction of methane and other compounds, come to the State of the Science Summit. You'll meet the right people to network with, and you'll get it right from the horse's mouth. We'll have the world's best scientists from not just UC Davis, but also other places that I think do a really good job breaking things down so that everybody understands. And we have the right mix of people, not just people from industry and academia, but also NGOs, agencies, nationally, internationally, all here.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we'll put links up to that and to the QR code that you shared in your presentation up on our website at balchem.com/realscience. So with that, we will cut it off. Thank you, Dr. Mitloehner, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series continues with educational topics each month, including Dr. Laura Hernandez will present the role of the mammary gland in governing calcium metabolism. Our full schedule of webinars is now available online. Visit balchem.com/realscience for details on future webinars and to register for upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and search for Real Science Exchange or visit balchem.com/podcast. If you want a cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll get that right off to you. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Mitloehner, thank you for joining us today.